My grandson stopped breathing for 11 seconds while my son-in-law's family unloaded coolers in my driveway. I know it was 11 seconds because I counted them out loud to the 911 dispatcher, and I have never in my 61 years felt time move like that, thick and slow, like wading through wet concrete. My name doesn't matter for this story. What matters is that I'd spent 40 years building a small construction supply business from a single flatbed truck, and I'd spent the last 3 of those years babysitting my grandson Tommy twice a week so my daughter Karen could keep her nursing shifts at the hospital. Tommy had been born early, 7 weeks early, and his lungs never quite caught up to the rest of him. Every cold turned into something worse. Every fever came with a trip to the pediatric ER. Karen and her husband Brian knew this. Everyone in the family knew this, or at least I thought they did. Right up until the afternoon, they decided it didn't matter. It was a Tuesday in late June, hot enough that the asphalt on my street had gone soft at the edges. I live in a lake house outside Sandusky, Ohio, the kind of place I bought 30 years ago when a lake house was still something a supply company owner could afford outright, back before the lake got fashionable and the taxes tripled. I built most of the dock myself. I redid the kitchen twice. My late wife, Diane, picked out every piece of furniture in that house before she passed, and I hadn't changed a single cushion since, because changing things felt like erasing her, and I wasn't ready for that. The house was mine, paid off, deeded only to me. Brian's family had never had a dime in it. That detail matters later. Tommy had been staying with me that week because Karen was pulling doubles and Brian was on a work trip to Pittsburgh. Tommy had a cold on Sunday. By Monday night, it had turned into something with a wet, rattling cough that scared me enough to call Karen at the nurse's station and ask her what she thought. She said, keep an eye on his breathing, count how many times his chest rises in a minute, call if it goes over 40. I'd done that kind of counting before, more times than any grandfather should have to, and I didn't love how close he was getting to that number by Tuesday morning. That's when my phone lit up with a text in the family group chat, the one Brian's mother Sandra had named Lake Week 2026 back in April. I'd mostly muted it because it filled up with photos of somebody's paddleboard and a running argument about whose turn it was to bring the good salsa. This message was different. Sandra had written, everyone's confirmed for Thursday through the following Wednesday. 14 of us total. Marty's bringing the boat trailer. Please make sure the guest rooms are made up and the cooler space in the garage fridge is cleared out. I read it twice. The way you read something you can't quite believe was sent to you. She hadn't asked if the house was even available that week. She hadn't asked me at all, actually, not one word, as if the fact that I owned the place had simply stopped being relevant to her plans. I typed back that Tommy was sick, that I had him with me, and that this really wasn't a good week. The reply came fast, and it wasn't from Sandra. It was from her husband Gary, my son-in-law's father, a man I'd known for 11 years and never once seen apologize for anything. Gary wrote, everybody already took off work. Boats reserved at the marina. We'll bring our own groceries. It'll be fine. The kids will be quiet. 14 people. 4 dogs, because somebody's cousin was bringing 2 golden retrievers along with the family's own lab. 3 vehicles at minimum. All of it descending on a 4-bedroom lake house while a 2-year-old with compromised lungs was fighting off a respiratory infection 20 feet from the guest rooms they wanted made up. I sat at my kitchen table that morning with Tommy asleep against my shoulder, his breath coming in these short little pulls that didn't sound right to me, and I thought about every summer before this one. The year Gary showed up 2 days early without calling, walked in with his own key like he'd forgotten whose house it was. The year Sandra left a shopping list taped to my refrigerator door, printed out like an assignment. The year I just mentioned, that the dock needed new boards, and Gary told me he'd get to it eventually, and eventually never came, and I fixed it myself that October with a bad shoulder and a rented drill. I'd spent 6 years letting this family treat my house like a resort with an absentee owner who happened to also do the maintenance for free. I typed one word back to the group chat. Fine. Then I set the phone face down on the table, and Tommy stirred against me, made this small, unhappy sound, and I felt his forehead again, warmer than it had been an hour before. I picked the phone back up, not to answer Gary, but to call my property manager, a guy named Ellis who'd installed the smart lock system on the house 2 summers ago, after somebody's teenager lost a physical key at a bonfire. I left him a voicemail asking if he could come by first thing Wednesday morning. The guilt showed up almost immediately, the way it always does with me. Sandra and Gary were in their late 60s. The trip had been planned for months. Somebody, somewhere, was going to call me the villain of this story before the week was even over, and some small, tired part of me already believed them. Then Tommy opened his eyes just barely and said, in that thin, croaky voice sick toddlers get, pop, pop, too loud. There hadn't been any noise in that kitchen except the refrigerator humming. He wasn't talking about anything happening in the room. He was talking about what was coming. That was the whole argument, settled in 3 words from a 2-year-old who didn't know the first thing about lake houses or group chats or 6 years of me saying yes to everything. I drove Tommy to urgent care myself that afternoon because his breathing had climbed past 42 and I wasn't willing to wait and see. Karen met us there straight from her shift, still in scrubs, and the 2 of us sat in a fluorescent-lit room while a doctor listened to our grandson's chest with a stethoscope and used words like bronchiolitis and keep a close watch and come back immediately if. Not one person in that Lake Week group chat had asked how Tommy was doing. Not one. My phone buzzed twice while we were in that exam room, and both times it was Sandra asking whether I'd bought the good coffee creamer or the store brand. Ellis met me at the lake house Wednesday morning around 9. He'd known this family for years, watched 3 generations of them tramp in and out of that place every summer, and I could tell my request caught him off guard. New code on the front door, I told him. Kill every old guest code completely. Separate lock for the boathouse. And check that the doorbell camera is still recording properly. He raised an eyebrow, but he didn't argue with me. Family trouble, he said, more statement than question. I told him it wasn't a trouble so much as a decision, long overdue. While Ellis worked, I walked through my own house, like a stranger casing it. I cleared the perishables out of the fridge. I packed a bag with Tommy's things. The little dinosaur nightlight Diane had bought him before she died, his sippy cup, the blanket Karen had left folded on the guest bed the week before. I brought the deck chairs into the garage because a storm was rolling in off the lake. I closed the blinds. I set the thermostat to its low summer setting. I didn't shut off the water or the power. I wasn't trying to hurt anybody. I just wasn't going to open that door. Before I left, I taped a single sheet of paper to the inside of the front window, facing out, where anyone standing on the porch would see it plainly. House closed this week. Family emergency. My phone rang as I was locking the garage. Gary. I almost let it go. I answered anyway. He didn't ask about Tommy either. Did you get the dock cleared off? He said. I told him there weren't going to be any guests at the house this week. There was a pause long enough that I could hear a television somewhere behind him. You don't get to embarrass Sandra like this, he said, after everything we've done for this family. I felt the old reflex kick in, the one that wanted to apologize before he'd even finished the sentence. Then I thought about Tommy's chest rising too fast against my hand in that exam room, and I said, this isn't about Sandra being embarrassed, Gary. My grandson can't breathe right. He said something about families adjusting. That's exactly what I'm doing, I told him, and I hung up before he could answer. My hand was shaking a little afterward, which surprised me. 61 years old and a phone call from my son-in-law's father could still do that to me. On my drive back to Karen's house, Sandra sent the group chat a full room assignment for all 14 people, as though nothing I'd said had registered at all. Gary and Sandra get the master, obviously. His back's been bad. I sat at a red light reading that, and instead of the guilt I expected, I felt something closer to clarity settle into my chest. I opened the lock app right there at the intersection and deleted every remaining code one by one until the screen showed nothing but my own name. A notification popped up. All guest access removed. By Thursday afternoon, I was at Karen's place, helping her son-in-law free household get some rest while Tommy's fever finally started to break. Karen sat on the couch with him propped against her chest, and I was in the kitchen washing bottles, trying to keep my hands busy so my mind would stop circling back to the lake. At 2:15 that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a motion alert from the doorbell camera. I opened it without really thinking, and there they were. 3 vehicles pulling into my driveway. Gary's truck first, hauling the boat trailer. Sandra behind him in her Buick. Behind that, Brian's cousin's minivan, packed to the windows with coolers and pool noodles sticking out the back window. 14 people climbed out over the next several minutes. Suitcases, folding chairs, 4 dogs straining on their leashes, kids already running toward the water before anyone had even checked the door. I watched it unfold in silence on a 6-inch screen while standing in my daughter's kitchen 60 miles away. At first, they thought the keypad was simply broken. I could see Gary punching in the old code, trying again, shaking his head at it like the machine had betrayed him personally. Sandra had her phone out already. Marty, Brian's uncle, was walking the perimeter of the house, checking for a side door that had never existed in 30 years of that house standing there. The calls started almost immediately. I let the first two go to voicemail. Sandra's voice, more confused than angry at first. "The code isn't working. Call me back." Then Gary, sharper. "Very funny. Send the new code now." Then Gary again, the one that actually got under my skin a little. "Your daughter's going to hear about this. Fix it." I sat there with the phone in my hand, feeling that old pull to just make it stop, send the code, smooth it over one more time the way I always had for 6 straight years. They were in their late 60s. There were kids standing in that driveway in the heat. I didn't want anyone actually stranded with nowhere to go. So I sent one message to the whole chat, nothing more. "The house is closed this week. There's a Hampton Inn and a Holiday Inn Express, both off Route 250. 10 minutes away, and I already called ahead. They've got rooms." I wasn't trying to strand my own family in a parking lot with no plan. I just wasn't opening my door. That's when my neighbor Walt came across the road. Walt's lived across from that lake house for going on 25 years. A retired machinist who mostly keeps to himself, but with 14 people and 3 vehicles blocking half the road, I guess he figured somebody ought to say something. Gary asked him if he had a spare key. "I don't," Walt said. "He told me last night his grandson's real sick," said the house was closed. Sandra told him this was the family's lake house, always had been. Walt just shrugged and said, "Calm as anything, it's his house. Always has been. I've watched him pay that dock off board by board for 30 years. I heard about that part secondhand later, but apparently that one sentence landed harder on Gary than anything I'd said to him on the phone the day before. It wasn't an accusation. It was just a fact nobody in that driveway particularly liked hearing out loud. Somewhere in the middle of all this, one of the dogs got loose from Marty's grip and knocked over a cooler, sending ice sliding across the gravel in every direction. A bag of hot dog buns split open against the mailbox post. And in the middle of all that chaos, one of the kids, I think it was Marty's daughter, asked loud enough that the doorbell mic caught every word of it clearly. "Grandpa Gary, I thought you said this was our house." Gary didn't have an answer for that one either. Back at Karen's, she asked if I wanted to call anybody back. "Part of me does," I admitted. She didn't push me one way or the other. She just reminded me gently that Tommy had finally fallen asleep for the first real stretch in almost 2 days. A few minutes later, my phone rang again, Gary a third time, and the sound of it startled Tommy awake. He started crying. This thin, exhausted cry that undid something in my chest faster than any voicemail from Gary ever could. I put the phone on silent. That night, Brian posted something on Facebook. My own father-in-law locked my parents and half our family out of our lake house after they drove 3 hours with a boat reserved. Guess some people forget where they came from. No mention of Tommy. No mention that I'd told Gary the day before. No mention that I'd texted 2 hotel names the second they pulled in. Within an hour, relatives I hadn't spoken to in years were messaging me directly. An aunt of Brian's I actually respected called and asked, "Couldn't you have handled that differently?" And for about 10 minutes sitting in Karen's driveway, I started to wonder if she had a point. That night, Tommy woke up coughing hard enough that Karen sat him upright against her chest to help him breathe easier. My phone kept lighting up on the counter with messages I wasn't reading. Tommy pressed his face into his mother's shoulder and murmured the only thing that mattered in that whole house. "Too loud, Mommy." I turned my phone off completely. The locks, I was starting to understand, had been the easy part. Friday morning, Tommy's breathing still hadn't improved the way the doctor had hoped, so Karen and I took him back in. While she filled out paperwork at the front desk, I sat in one of those hard plastic chairs scrolling through my phone and found Brian's post had already been shared into the extended family group, the one with cousins and second cousins I mostly only see at funerals. Somebody had called me heartless. Somebody else used the word senile, which stung more than I expected from someone I'd known 30 years. I sat there seriously considering just reopening the house the following week to make the noise stop. Karen came back and sat down beside me, and she must have read something on my face, because instead of arguing with me about it, she reached into her bag and pulled out an old accordion folder I hadn't seen in years. I didn't even know she'd kept it. Inside were receipts, old bank transfers, screenshots of texts asking for help, records she'd kept mostly for her own peace of mind. tracking every dollar and every hour I'd ever put into that family on the other side of her marriage. "You keep remembering what they needed, Dad," she said, flipping it open on her lap. "I kept remembering what it cost you. We went through it together right there in that waiting room while we waited for Tommy's name to be called." The total came to just over $191,000 across 11 years. Cash, materials, direct payments, and that wasn't counting the countless unpaid weekends I'd spent with a toolbox in my truck. Three memories stood out as we sat there turning pages. Back in 2019, Gary had come up $18,000 short refinancing his own house after a bad investment. I'd told myself at the time that family helps family, and I'd pulled it from money Diane and I had been saving for a trip to Ireland we never ended up taking because she got sick that winter and never got better. Gary promised to pay it back within a year. He never did. 6 months later, he bought a new pontoon boat. In 2022, Karen and I had finally planned to take Tommy, just the two of us, on his first real vacation, a long weekend down at Hocking Hills. 3 days before we were supposed to leave, Sandra's roof started leaking above the garage. Gary didn't want to pay a roofer. "Your father knows how to do it," he told Karen. I canceled the trip, spent 4 days up on that roof at 61 years old, paid for the shingles and the flashing myself. Karen spent what should have been Tommy's first real vacation sitting alone in an empty house. And when I apologized to her afterward, all she said was, "I know you think they need you." And then there was the lake house itself, slowly turning into something that wasn't really mine anymore, even though my name was the only one on the deed. The first summer after Diane passed, Sandra had started inviting people out without asking me at all, and I hadn't objected, because objecting felt like one more thing to grieve. It just became the pattern after that. Gary brought friends out for long weekends. Sandra kept her own beach towels folded in my linen closet like she lived there. Marty called the boathouse hours like he'd ever swung a hammer on it. Sitting there with that folder open across both our laps, I realized the money wasn't actually the part that hurt most. What hurt was understanding I'd spent 6 years buying peace with my daughter's in-laws, using my late wife's house, my own retirement savings, and time I could never get back with my grandson while he was still small enough to want me around. I kept telling myself I was holding this family together, I said out loud, mostly to myself. Karen didn't look away from me. "You were," she said. "You just forgot Tommy and I were part of that family too." It wasn't said to wound me. It just landed the way true things do. When the doctor cleared Tommy to go home with a new inhaler and a follow-up in a week, I carried him out to the car myself. He was too tired to react when I buckled him into his car seat, his head lolling to one side, breath still a little quicker than I liked. I thought about 14 people trying to walk into that quiet house, with dogs barking and coolers banging against door frames, while a 2-year-old struggled just to fill his lungs in the next room over, and any last doubt I had about those locks disappeared completely. That evening, once Tommy was settled and finally sleeping properly, I sent one more message to the family chat. "I want everyone at the lake house 3 weeks from this Saturday. I'll explain everything once, in person. After that, the new rules stand, and they're final." Gary replied almost immediately. "Good. You owe everyone an apology, especially your daughter's family." I looked over at that accordion folder still sitting open on my kitchen table and realized he genuinely believed I was inviting them out to surrender. 3 weeks later, Tommy was almost back to himself, chasing my neighbor's cat along the fence line and demanding a snack every 20 minutes like a boy who'd never had a sick day in his life. Watching him run barefoot across the grass made everything that came next a lot easier to sit through. The meeting happened that Saturday afternoon, out on the deck of the lake house itself, because I wasn't about to have this conversation anywhere else. Karen kept the food simple: burgers off the grill, a pitcher of sweet tea, a bowl of coleslaw nobody touched. Nobody showed up expecting a cookout. They showed up expecting an apology and a reopened house. Brian hadn't taken his Facebook post down yet. Gary sat at the picnic table first, arms crossed, and got right to it. "Before we eat, Sandra deserves to hear what you have to say for yourself." I didn't argue with him. I walked around the table and set a single sheet of paper in front of each adult. One line at the top: what I paid, what I provided, and what changes, starting today. I told them plainly I wasn't asking a soul to pay a dime back. I just wanted the numbers said once, out loud, so nobody could pretend they didn't exist. $18,000 for Gary's refinancing shortfall. $9,200 in emergency payments after that. $14,000 in medical costs for Sandra's knee surgery back when her insurance lapsed. $22,000 in materials and labor on their house over the years. Close to $40,000 in groceries, utilities, repairs, and cleaning tied to this lake house alone. $191,000, give or take, over 11 years. Gary said I was treating family like a business deal. No, I told him. A business would have sent invoices. I never did, not once. He pushed back harder, said the whole family had used this house for years, so locking everybody out over one sick kid was cruel. That's when Karen spoke for the first time all afternoon. Using something for years doesn't make it yours, she said, and she set a printed text message down in front of him, one Sandra had sent the summer before. Tell Karen to move her father's boat gear out of the boathouse before we get there. It's in our way. Why was I supposed to clear my own father's things out of his own boathouse? She asked Sandra directly. Sandra didn't have an answer for that. I told Gary I wanted the Facebook post taken down, or at minimum corrected with the truth. He said it reflected how he honestly felt in the moment. Then leave it up, I said, but I'm posting the group chat screenshots underneath it, starting with the one where I told you Tommy couldn't breathe right and you told me nothing was changing. Gary went quiet fast. He knew exactly what was sitting in that thread. Brian's aunt, sitting a few chairs down, looked over at Gary and said, "You left that part out, didn't you?" Gary muttered something about Facebook not being the place for every little detail. Apparently it was the place for every detail that made me look bad, she said. And nobody at that table argued with her. Sandra tried a different angle. After everything this family has done for you since Diane passed, this is how you treat us. I didn't deny they'd shown up for me some, early on, in their own limited way. You've been there, I said. I'm not pretending you haven't. But that doesn't give you a lifetime claim on my house, my savings, or my time with my own grandson. Her voice cracked a little after that. We were only trying to keep everyone together as a family, she said. Karen answered that one, calm as anything. You tried to bring 14 people into a house while a 2-year-old had pneumonia risk sitting right on top of a respiratory infection. That wasn't keeping us together. That was telling us we didn't matter at all. Sandra started crying, and something in me wanted to take the whole thing back right there, pour her some tea, let it all dissolve the way arguments in this family always used to. But then I thought about Tommy flinching at a ringing phone, whispering too loud, and I stayed exactly where I was. I laid out the new terms plainly. Nobody uses this lake house again without Karen and me both agreeing to it ahead of time. No more self-scheduled trips to property that isn't theirs. No more informal loans without something in writing. I'd still show up for real emergencies, but I was done covering Gary's boat payments and Sandra's home repairs indefinitely. And anyone who used my grandson's health as leverage again would lose the right to set foot on this property at all. Gary asked if I was choosing my daughter's side over the family that had known me longest. I looked through the kitchen window at Tommy stacking blocks on the living room floor with Karen's mother-in-law from her side, the one relative who'd actually shown up with soup that week without being asked. I'm choosing the family I'm responsible for, I told him. Then I asked one last question, and I made sure it landed slow. Can any one of you name a single time you asked me before inviting people to my own house? Nobody answered. Not Gary, not Sandra. Not even Marty, who usually had something to say about everything. The silence said everything I'd spent 3 weeks trying to put into words. That's why the locks changed, I said. Brian deleted his Facebook post before he even left the driveway that afternoon. Not because his mind had changed about any of it, but because he didn't want that group chat screenshot sitting underneath it for the whole family to see. Before Gary left, he told me I'd torn this family apart over one bad week. No, I told him. I stopped pretending it wasn't already broken. Gary and Sandra didn't speak to me for almost 4 months after that Saturday. That part still stings more than I expected it to, even now. They'd been in my life a long time, difficult as they were, and there were nights that fall I lay awake wondering if I could have drawn the same line without quite so much blood along with it. What I noticed, though, was how much lighter the rest of my life felt once the bleeding actually stopped. Money that used to disappear into somebody else's emergency started staying in my own account, the one I'd been meaning to use for Tommy's college fund all along. Karen and I finally took him up to Hocking Hills that October, just the 3 of us. No roof waiting to be fixed, no grocery list taped to a refrigerator that had never once been Gary's to stock. My knees still ache most mornings, and my shoulder still has opinions about ladders. But at least I wasn't spending my weekends propping up somebody else's life for free anymore. My relationship with Gary and Sandra never healed in any clean, movie kind of way, and I stopped expecting it to somewhere around Thanksgiving. Gary never once apologized. Not directly. Sandra sent careful, stiff texts around the holidays that read more like obligation than warmth. I didn't cut either of them off completely. I still called to check on Sandra's knee, still asked how Gary's shoulder surgery had gone that winter, but I stopped being the automatic answer to every problem that showed up in their lives. When Gary's truck broke down that January, I gave him the number of a good mechanic instead of driving 3 hours with my own toolbox. He wasn't thrilled about that. He handled it anyway, which surprised me more than it should have. About 5 months after that Saturday on the deck, my phone rang, and it was Sandra. I braced myself the way I always used to before picking up. She didn't say we're coming Saturday. She didn't announce anything at all. Would it be all right, she said, hesitating in a way I genuinely never heard from her before, if Gary and I came by for a couple hours Sunday afternoon just to see Tommy? It wasn't an apology. I want to be honest about that. It wasn't some movie moment where 6 years got resolved in one phone call. But it was the first time in longer than I could remember that she'd actually asked me instead of telling me. I looked over at Karen, who was folding Tommy's little shirts on the couch, and she gave me a small nod. Sunday from 2 to 5 works, I told Sandra. Tommy naps before that. We'll come after his nap, she said. Small, almost nothing really if you didn't know our history. But it was real. The following spring, the three of us drove back out to the lake house together for the first time since that Thursday the year before. Tommy was 3 now, steady on his feet, and he ran straight down toward the water with a little plastic bucket like he owned the place, which in a way now, he finally did. Karen sat on the dock with a cup of coffee, watching him dig a hole in the sand far too big for that little shovel of his. I walked up to the front door before we went inside and checked the lock, out of habit more than anything else. It didn't feel like a weapon in my hand anymore. It was just a lock, the same as every house has. The plain, ordinary right to decide who gets to walk through your own front door. I've thought a lot since then about what the real payoff in all of this actually was. It wasn't the number in that folder. It wasn't the image of 14 people standing confused in my driveway with ice melting across the gravel. It was something quieter than either of those. It was making sure my grandson never grows up believing that love means letting people ignore what you need to be safe. Karen came up beside me while Tommy kept digging. Any regrets, Dad? She asked. I watched my grandson toss sand everywhere, laughing at nothing in particular, breathing easy for the first time in what felt like years. Only that I waited so long to do it, I told her. If you've ever had to draw a line with your own family, you already know it never comes easy, and it almost never comes clean. But sometimes the people who love you the most are standing right in front of you the whole time, just waiting for you to finally notice them. Take care of the ones who actually respect your home and your heart, because everyone else was only ever borrowing both. Loving your family doesn't mean handing them the keys to your peace. Sometimes the kindest thing you can do for them and for yourself is close a door quietly instead of slamming it, and wait to see who actually knocks afterward. The ones who do are the ones worth keeping close. And the space you protected was never selfish, it was just finally yours. A small note for you. This story was written and fictionalized by AI purely for entertainment, though we hope the small life lesson tucked inside it stays with you a little longer.